So back, it's probably been 8 years at this point. We inherited kind of this early model and this small footprint of AWS at Fiserv. And so at the time, I think we started with about five accounts, and we scaled that up to about 25 following this model. And so the model that we use from an identity perspective is each one of those AWS accounts. And at the time, we would have, a non-production account for an application, but we'd also have a production. So this view that you're seeing right here might encompass just a single application. But within each of those, each user that was working in the account would have their own identity and set up as an IAM user. So in this case, John is our admin of the accounts. And so John has two user principals. He's got a set of credentials in app one, and in this case, our account's listed as app two, but that could be, dev and production. And then we've got a handful of developers that are doing work. So we've got Dave and Mary that are acting as our developers. And so they've both got credentials in each of these accounts. Now, if you're at 5 accounts, this is not really a pain point yet. When you start to get up to about 25 users, then you start to realize that John's struggling to keep track, and John may have access to 2 accounts or 5 accounts, but your team that's managing your AWS environment might now have 25 sets of credentials. And so if you've got 50, 75, or even 100 users, depending on the size of your development teams, this starts to stretch this model and starts to kind of break things down, right? So at this point, we kind of took a step back and we said, okay, this is not working really well. Let's do a deep dive on some of the identity concepts within AWS, and there's got to be a better way. So we go to the next slide, please. So we kind of took this next step in our AWS identity journey, which is we looked at it and we said, okay, well, there's a service called STS, which allows us to assume roles in other accounts. So what if we create one account and we put all the users in there, and then we assign permissions to the users to let them change roles into this, into the other accounts that they're working in. There's no application workload in this auth account, so there's no permissions. We don't have to worry about people building stuff in there, but they can kind of log into this one place. We can manage our password policy. We can force MFA for the users, and then it can act as kind of a jumping off point. And we scaled this model up to about 100 users or 100 AWS accounts, and probably in the ballpark of 150 to 300 users. But we ran into some additional challenges with this model. So from our perspective, from an admin perspective, we would create a group. So you can see, John is now in our admins group and Dave and Mary are in the developers group. And the permissions assigned to that group, there was a policy that allowed them to assume the roles in their app account. But what we ended up with is we had to have a group created for each role for each account. So if you think about 100 accounts, if we've only got admins and developers, as the roles that we've deployed, we now have 200 groups that we have to manage the membership for. And so what we found here is the scaling problem manifested itself in a different way. We had a couple of folks that were working on entire portfolios of applications, and we actually realized that there's a maximum number of groups that a user can belong to. So then we had to collapse the groups into super groups. And as we scaled out custom roles, like we just really started ending up in this point where, while this was a nice middle ground, we really needed to rethink the model. Now, some of the automation that we had built to kind of ease the pain, because, with 300 users, we constantly had users forgetting their passwords, or they would expire, or they needed their MFA reset, or just onboarding users was a challenge. And so we got to the point where we had built some pretty sophisticated automation that was email based for some of the basic tasks, because our team was being overrun, with this operational burden of managing user credentials. And we were a cloud center of excellence. Like, our focus was on enabling teams, to get to the cloud, not doing user management. And so from here, we kind of moved into the next phase of our journey. So if you go to the next slide for me. And this is where things kind of get interesting and exciting from an identity perspective. And so we got together and we said, look, we know about STS, we know about role assumption. The problem that we had, both with an operational burden of all the users, is that we still had these static users. So we had 300 or so users that existed all the time. Now, users sometimes leak credentials. Sometimes they check them into, GitHub repositories. Sometimes those repositories are public, and you end up with attacks using valid credentials. And so when we moved into kind of this third phase of our identity journey for AWS, we said, is there a way that we can maybe use this role concept and the STS service to create something that's maybe not long-lived, that's maybe more ephemeral, and something that only exists when the users need to take action. And so we designed this tool internally. It did have a name, but we'll refer to it as our JIT portal, our just-in-time portal. And it really changed the workflow for our users. So we were able to take this portal and integrate it with our identity provider internally, which meant we got to offload, the user management functions. We were not resetting passwords anymore. We were not having to board users. We could auto create in our portal that user identity just to keep track of what they had access to. And so you can see here the flow is different, right? So the user, John, our admin, he logs into this just-in-time portal and he says, I want to use the admin role for our app account. And so he checks it out. And as long as he has the access to check out that role, we record the session in Dynamo. And then we do some magic with STS and role switching, and we effectively present John with the option of either grabbing some temporary credentials that are time-bound or dropping into the AWS console into that account as the admin role. And so this was a game changer for us. It allowed us to build in request process for new roles and new accounts, board users seamlessly. But we also knew that when John checked out those credentials, that there was an expiration to them. And so John's console session or his temporary credentials would expire after, we'll call it 2 hours or 4 hours. And so if for some reason those credentials got leaked, the impact to the firm was minimized because we were able to, number one, ensure that they were not long-lived, but also they were only available when John requested them. So at any given point in time, these credentials, or the user principals that existed had no standing access. And so from a risk and a security perspective, it let us sleep better at night knowing that we didn't have, 1,000 sets of credentials that were valid at what you would consider to be a privileged level of access. And so this concept scaled us up to about 500 AWS accounts and well over 1,000 users. I don't remember the exact count, but it was a pretty significant number of users that took us this far in our journey.
Chris, I have a curiosity at this point. When you had moved to this just-in-time model, were you able to get rid of or re-simplify some of those groups and roles that you had sort of built up from that previous version of it?
Yeah, so the roles existed. We use CloudFormation stack states to deploy roles into these accounts, but we got rid of the group concept altogether. So we effectively abandoned using the native IAM users, the IAM group constructs, because we simply didn't need them. We maintained all those entitlements directly in, our just-in-time portal through the use of Dynamo. And the other upside to this was, in this case, we built it all serverless. So we didn't even have an ops burden with running the tool. And so it was very nice. It allowed us to kind of get around some of the inherent, we'll call it restrictions or quota related issues that existed in running identity at scale within the AWS platform.
Great. And another question related to, you said, I think at this point you had integrated with your corporate identity provider and some of those tools. Is that something you did earlier in this journey, or was this more once you had gotten to this level of scale?
Yeah, it was limited to when we got to this point. Now, it's important to remember that when we started working on this, some of the concepts like AWS SSO or what is now identity didn't really exist, right? So integrating something like an IDP into the cloud was a challenge at that point, right? It didn't exist. And so we bridged that gap using an OpenID Connect into a custom portal to kind of front end the identity story. But the story doesn't end here. So this took us up to a certain point. So if you go to the next slide for me, Matt. Enter stage left, Britive. And so we were introduced to Britive as a company. And at that point, it allowed us to kind of continue to scale this concept because now there was a commercially viable option on the table for us to consider that gave us the same user experience, just-in-time access, approvals, request workflows, things like that. And it aligned very nicely with kind of the custom tool that we had already built internally. And so we were thrilled, to find out that Britive existed because at this point in our journey, we were single cloud up to that point. And so that's that was our AWS identity story. But due to a merger, we ended up finding ourselves at a crossroads with needing to either extend our internal tool to cover Azure and a coming GCP footprint, or buy a tool, a Britive, if you will, that already covered the other cloud providers that we were going to move into. And so we have scaled our use of Britive well up over 800 AWS accounts, and many thousands of users at this point.
One thing I certainly want to ask here as well is that's a lot of users. The one thing that I hear, maybe 5 to 10x more potential users are these kind of non-human side of things, like the service principals, you've got federated workloads. How does that sort of fit into this whole piece here?
Yeah, so our journey started with the human users because we felt like that represented the largest risk, or I guess concern from a security perspective around access. We are still working through the non-human user side of that, and the scale there tends to dwarf the human users probably 5 to 1, right? So when you look at our cloud footprint today, there's thousands of service principals in Azure, thousands of IAM users, which is the construct we use for service accounts in AWS when a role assigned to an AWS service is non-sufficient. And so we are in the process now of figuring out, what's the right way to deconstruct that. We do have automation in place that handles, the creation of those native constructs today, but the goal is to move those into Britive. For us, Britive is integrated with the IDP, so the same story around the users. They're onboarded, they have access to Britive, they can request things. But Britive is also integrated with a lot of our access review policies and procedures. So we do quarterly access reviews or monthly access reviews or whatever it happens to be. And so by moving those non-human users into the tool, we end up getting to, two birds with one stone. We get to knock that same access review process out instead of exporting all these service accounts and figuring out who do they belong to and who should sign off and whatnot. And so, that's a part of our journey that continues today.